Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this year's Tanner lecture. Before I say a few introductory words, can I say the formal bit? There are 2 exits at the side and 1 at the rear, and there is no known practice, so if you hear the alarms go, please leave. Can I start by welcoming you all very warmly to this annual Tanner event, and start, as I always do, by thanking Robinson College, whose generosity makes this splendid auditorium available. I'd like to say to the Warden and the Fellows how very much all of us in Clare Hall appreciate that. I want to say a little bit about Tanner and why we're all here before I introduce this evening's lecture. As many of you, but not all of you, will know, the Tanner Lectures were established and endowed by an American scholar, industrialist and philanthropist, Obert Clark Tanner, in 1978. And Tanner Lectures are held annually in 10 of the world's leading universities. Clare Hall is very proud to be the college that hosts the annual Cambridge Tanner Lecture, and that's what you're all here to enjoy this evening. The purpose of the Tanner Lectures is to advance, and I quote, is to advance and reflect upon the scholarly and scientific learning related to human values. The Tanner Lecture in Human Values, the title of the series. And Professor Tanner, who is both a very successful businessman and a distinguished academic, an unusual combination, he was really very good at both, said, "I hope these lectures will contribute to the intellectual and moral life of mankind. I see them simply as a search for a better understanding of human behaviour and human values. That understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of personal and social life." And I think that sentence, when you think how some politicians react at the present time, that sentence sums it all up, doesn't it? Pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may, in certain circumstances, have value to society as a whole. And I think that's one of the reasons why Clare Hall is so pleased to host this particular series of lectures. Appointment as a Tanner Lecture is a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding abilities in some field with some aspect of human values in mind. And Obert Tanner was extremely wide-ranging in the disciplines from which he thought he could come: religion, philosophy, humanities, sciences, creative arts, and any of the learned professions, and from leadership in public or private affairs. And we are extremely grateful to the Tanner Foundation, and I might say personally I'm delighted that Stephen Tanner Irish is with us here today. Just before I introduce this year's Tanner Lecture, can I remind you that tomorrow at 5 o'clock, also here in Robinson, 3 distinguished scholars will be responding to this lecture, and everybody who's here this evening is welcome again at 5 o'clock tomorrow. The 3 respondents tomorrow, Dr. Stephen Bella, Professor Peter Pulser, and Professor Alan Janik, will themselves talk about themes related to tonight's theme, but tomorrow, unlike today, you will all have a chance to join in, because there'll be a full opportunity for questions and comments and responses from the respondents and indeed from our speaker this evening. So please, if you can, come again tomorrow. The Tanner Lecture is very much a 2-day event, and we'd like to see as many of you as possible coming here tomorrow. There will be this evening 2 lectures with a break for tea at around 6 o'clock. And the second lecture will be followed by a reception in Clare Hall, just across the road, to which everybody is welcome. And now a word about our Tanner lecturer this evening. And can I say how delighted that his wife Meg is here with him this evening. You're very welcome as well. Joseph Koerner, born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, raised both there and in Vienna. He studied at Yale, Cambridge, and Heidelberg, and at Berkeley. An impressive record of achievement in there. 3 years in Harvard University. Then he moved back to Europe, first to Frankfurt briefly, and then to both UCL and the Courtauld Institute in London. He then went back to Harvard, and where he is still now as the Thomas Professor of the History of Art and Architecture. Joseph has organized a whole variety of teaching exhibitions at Harvard, on early Netherlandish painting, German Renaissance art, Peter Bruegel, and of a whole variety of others. And I think one of the things that struck me in his CV was that he, in the late 90s, curated a retrospective exhibition of the work of his own father, the painter, Henry Koerner. And he told me yesterday that he remembers vividly as a child following his father around Vienna as his father found Viennese scenes and Viennese individuals to paint, and I think to have the opportunity later to curate an exhibition in that sense must have been a very satisfying moment. A distinguished author, a partial creator of a BBC documentary on Vienna, which was broadcast in December 2007. The list is really quite endless. And when you look at the prizes too that Joseph's won, it's really extraordinarily impressive. And I think I'll just say the last one, the 2009 Andrew W. Mellon Distinguished Achievement Award, which is enabling Joseph to do some of the things that he's currently engaged in. So there we are, a wonderful occasion, a very distinguished speaker, and it gives me great pleasure now to ask you to welcome Professor Joseph Koerner, who will talk about the Viennese interior, architecture and interior. You're very welcome, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm deeply honored to speak to you this evening, and I'm also humbled by my three distinguished respondents, each of whom knows far more about Vienna than I do, I must say. I'm a novice in this field. I also confess that addressing human values in a public setting professionally doesn't come naturally to me. It used to be that writing about art meant evaluating it. People judged whether and to what degree a work was beautiful, true, and right. But then, some 200 years ago, people began to judge art less and to interpret it more. And they interpreted art as a magical mirror of its own time. Art historians study art as an historical formation. We seek to answer when, where, how, and by whom an object came about. We might venture to ask why a thing was made. In doing so, we may confront questions of value, but we do this in a situated way. We study the value art had for other people in the enclave of a bygone era. This viewpoint belongs to the broader trend of treating the human sphere as the product of history. But the history of art played a key role in this trend. Art makes the difference between epochs visible at a glance, and these differences become cherished differences. Art historians try to value every artifact for what it tells them about the past. They seek, in a sense, to be value-free. A simple buckle or brooch should be as wondrous as an old master painting if it shows the volition of its epoch, since each epoch is equal under God. These late Roman bronzes were unearthed along the banks of the Danube River near Vienna. Published by the Viennese art historian Riegel in 1901, they exerted some influence on Viennese design. Riegel was a formalist. He spent pages describing the rhythm of those perforations. But Riegel went further. He detected in this rhythm a new Christian aesthetics and ethics that understood ugliness and evil as a recurrent interval in the beautiful and good. Riegel also claimed that this emancipation of the interval paved the way for Renaissance art, which unified figure and ground through perspective. What matters, though, is this. For Riegel, people reveal their values through making. Human fabrication is even expressive during periods of decline, with these bronzes, the era of the so-called barbarian invasions. Around 1900, during its golden age, Vienna was the capital of this new value-free art history. Periods that previously had been deemed backward were redeemed scientifically as meaningful. When in 1891 the Habsburg collections opened to the public in this palatial edifice, it received the name Das Kunsthistorische Museum. This museum of art history formed part of an expanding imperial forum. There, for over half a century, Franz Joseph, the emperor, ruled over his vast territories of Austro-Hungary. Though weak and internally divided, this empire had roots in the Middle Ages. It could boast an origin via Charlemagne in ancient Rome. And its treasury contained not just famous masterpieces by Dürer, Raphael, and Bruegel. It contained also sacred relics, including the lance believed to have pierced Christ's side. In Vienna, art history was atavistic. The ruling Habsburg dynasty was 1,000 years old. It could still claim supreme authority in Central Europe well beyond its Austrian domain. Religion sanctified its sovereignty. Vienna stands at the easternmost fringe of the Alps. It's been Europe's embattled fortress, first in Roman times against the barbarians, then in the early modern period against the Turkish infidel, here a woodcut of the 1529 Siege of Vienna. During the Reformation, the city was kept staunchly Catholic, violently crushing Protestant heresy. In the 19th century, Vienna stood for Old Europe, where sovereignty was universal rather than national. Although German happened to be the dominant language in Central Europe, Austro-Hungary had no special link to it. Ethnic differences between Germans, Slavs, Magyars, Jews, and Muslims were funneled into a broad division of labor between clerics, bureaucrats, traders, and peasants. The pluralistic understanding of the history of art tried to put different cultures on separate but equal footing. This understanding made special sense in Vienna. It also fostered a heightened eclecticism in this city's built environment. Architecture in Vienna was a game of styles. Before designing a building structure, architects determined its style. Star architects mobilized all possible styles, building a Gothic church on one occasion, here the Votivkirche, and a Renaissance palazzo on another, here Vienna's University. These two buildings stood side by side on the Ring Street, and it was here that eclecticism flourished most dramatically. The Ringstrasse belts the old city of Vienna with trams and traffic. Its circular course, really octagonal, derives from the city's protective walls. In 1857, Franz Joseph ordered those walls be raised and the land be turned into a major thoroughfare, with the Imperial Palace and St. Stephen's Cathedral, throne and altar, as it were, inside the ring, and new public edifices outside. In the new buildings, style followed from function, but in a mediated way. Style captured the historical origins of the institution a building housed. So Attic, for example, Neo-Attic for Parliament because democracy arose in Athens, Flemish Gothic for the City Hall because civic culture flourished in Brussels and Bruges, French Baroque for the Burgtheater because of its theatrical heritage, and so forth. These buildings are now patinated. To an untrained eye, they look genuinely Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque. I've found that many sightseers to the Votivkirche, completed in 1875, think they are visiting St. Stephen's Cathedral, consecrated 7 centuries earlier. But when they were built, the Ring Street buildings looked spanking new, and because they looked new, their styles clashed. The history of art begged the question, what should the style of the modern era look like? One voice named the crisis. Vienna was the Potemkin city, a false show of facades. It resembled the cardboard and canvas villages that Prince Potemkin purportedly erected to fool his sovereign Catherine the Great. Adolf Loos published this invective in 1898 in the newly founded journal Versacrum. Beneath an architectural fantasy by Joseph Hoffmann and beside Jugendstil flowers, Loos wounded his city's pride. Chiefly, he targeted the apartment blocks arising around the ring. There, the city's wealthy bourgeoisie made their home. Uniquely among European architects, Loos had spent his Wanderjahre in the States and had admired Louis Sullivan's skyscrapers in Chicago. Loos ridiculed the fakery of Vienna's rent palaces, as they were called. Metternich famously quipped that Asia begins on the Landstrasse, on the dusty road that begins at the ring and winds eastward towards Hungary. Potemkin built his villages in Crimea, in that easterly direction that the Viennese try perpetually to disavow. So Loos's words stung, especially because they were true. Quote, "These Renaissance and Baroque palaces aren't even constructed from the materials they appear to be. Some pretend to be of stone, of plaster, some of plaster. They are neither. Their ornamental features, their corbels, wreaths, cartouches, and dentils are cast in cement and pinned on," end quote. This deceit was moral. Builders copied the city palaces of Baroque Vienna. These splendid buildings had housed the landed nobles of the Habsburg Empire who had to reside in the capital during court sessions. Though wreathed in allegories and coats of arms, such residences had a functional layout. Stables on the ground floor, servants on the mezzanine, reception rooms on the high first floor, living quarters above. The new cast cement facades mimicked the arrangement with the same ornaments and symbols around the windows and over the doors. But behind the facade, the building was divided up into many private apartment units. Thus, Loos writes, even the ordinary man who has only rented a top-story room and sleeping cabinet feels some lordly grandeur and feudal magnificence when he looks at his home that he lives in from outside, end quote. People deceive and are deceived, and this deception stems from shame. People are ashamed of being bourgeois. From the noble standpoint, the one these buildings affect, to be bourgeois means being next to nothing. Poverty is no disgrace, concludes Loos. We should stop feeling ashamed. After they had eaten the forbidden fruit, the eyes of Eve and Adam were opened and they knew that they were naked. The ethical begins with shame, and through shame, ethics entered powerfully the Viennese art world. Loos understood the facade ethically as a face. His most famous design faced Vienna's facade of facades, the entrance to the Hofburg on the Michaelerplatz at the heart of the old city. The Loos House, as it's now called, launched architectural modernism. At its street level, it's an elegant men's clothing store, was an elegant men's clothing store. Supported by a modern steel framework, the building needed no such columns to hold it up, however. They were for elegance, but their material is real, expensive, richly veined imported marble. Meanwhile, for the private apartments on the upper floors, Loos emptied the facade of ornament, and this sparked a public outcry. Vienna's building commission tried to force a facade on this facade, urged on, as Loos gleefully revealed in an article, by the city's largest producer of fake stone. Franz Josef permanently curtained his offices on the Michaelerplatz in order not to behold, or perhaps to be held by, this house without eyebrows. For as that popular phrase suggests, Loos's facade stares at the Hofburg's portal. Completed in 1893, the imperial facade features what Loos's building wordlessly attacks, a decor made largely of cast concrete. If the Loos house's lack of ornament made it an eyesore, its genuine marble insulted the cement symbols of empire, suggesting that the old order might be hollow, or as Loos's admirer Karl Kraus put it, es rieselt in Gemäuer, the plaster is crumbling from within. At a meeting of the building commission, a councilman sketched a facade over Loos's empty facade. He wanted to preserve the image of old Vienna. To lay the facade bare was to attack this image and expose the city to ethical critique. Loos's admirers understood this. Kraus, the prophet of the Viennese apocalypse, compared his critique of deceptive language to Loos's repudiation of false decor. The dream of unornamented expression links such diverse creations as Schoenberg's music and Wittgenstein's philosophy, as the author of Wittgenstein's Vienna taught us long ago, who's in our group. And the attempt to peer past the false facades to a shameful interior unites these iconoclasts to the investigations of Schnitzler and Freud and to the nudes of Klimt, Schiele, and Kokoschka. Whether or not these figures constituted a coherent movement, later observers would argue they did. If at 1900 the false facade was a symbol of Vienna, after 1918, when Austria was reduced to a tiny Alpine republic, Vienna and its facades became a symbol of European moral crisis generally. Writing in the post-war years, Robert Musil opened The Man Without Qualities with a street view glimpse of the hero's home, as if that facade heralded the ethical crisis of being without identifiable values or qualities. Musil set his story in 1913 on the eve of Sarajevo, but the catastrophe that haunts the novel is not in the past. Vienna of the 1920s and 30s knew its end lay ahead. After Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, few were left to finish the story, and after 1945, the world no longer cared much. Hermann Broch, the towering figure in European literature before World War II, spent his last years composing an historical account of the Vienna of his youth. Framed as a study of the poetical Wunderkind, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, it intended to diagnose Europe's self-destruction. Broch opens where Loos did, quote, "The essential character of the period," Broch begins, "can be deciphered from its architectural facade, and in the case of the second half of the 19th century, that facade was certainly one of the most wretched in world history," end quote. False ornament hid something more sinister than shame. For Broch, it concealed misery, and misery concealed breeds cruelty. Quote, "The bourgeoisie wasn't yet cruel, even though," Broch adds, "they were preparing themselves to become cruel." As a young man, Broch defended the Loos house, but had also glimpsed an aesthetic apocalypse in its iconoclastic facade. After ornament, he conjectured, there would only be cultural void. 2 world wars later, Broch looked back on this emptiness and saw it had been an ethical void. Vienna at 1900, he realized, was a value vacuum. The old systems of belief had survived longer in Vienna than in any other European capital. These beliefs disintegrated, and into the vacuum, he argued, there streamed new systems, some flawed, like the ethical compromises of Hugo von Hofmannsthal, some dangerous, like the anti-Semitism of Hitler's teachers in Vienna, Karl Lueger and Georg von Schönerer. So you see, Vienna veritably forces the art historian to deal with value. I'll explore this perception of a value vacuum through one of its aesthetic symptoms, not the facade, but what lies behind it, the Viennese interior. This interior mirrored the facade. Ornament abounded, historical styles multiplied and clashed, and function lay hidden. Here the atelier of the painter Hans Mackart. As the Viennese writer Egon Friedel put it, quote, "These rooms aren't living rooms but pawn shops. Delight lay in the unreal. Every material used tries to look more than it is. Should any utensil serve a purpose, this must in no case be obvious from its shape. The butter knife is a Turkish dagger, the ashtray a Prussian helmet, the umbrella stand a knight in armor, the thermometer a pistol. Here the best room was not intended to be lived in at all, but was only there to be exhibited to friends," end quote. Unlike the public facade, though, these interiors served as refuge for the private individual. Walter Benjamin, writing under the influence of Viennese critics, understood such interiors as an artificial envelope, an étui for the nervous bourgeois subject. The interior was both architecture and psychic space. When Viennese designers sought to reinvent the built interior, they did so with the human soul in mind. Homemaking became a period obsession, engaging not only architects and artists, but philosophers and psychologists as well. Ludwig Wittgenstein spent 3 crucial years between his failed stint as a schoolteacher and his second philosophical career designing the interior of his sister's villa in Vienna. And Freud devoted great energy to furnishing his offices and home. He promised his wife before they married a beautiful home, ein schönes Heim, and filled his offices with precious antiques. But I have an admission. I wouldn't be speaking about Vienna in front of such an audience if a personal mystery didn't urge me on. This painting hung above my bed in my childhood home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My father painted it in 1943. It shows his parents in the apartment he left in 1938 when he fled Vienna. He painted it in Washington while serving in the U.S. Army. It shows the typical Viennese interior of the 1920s when my father was a boy. He liked to tangle the apartment with that string his mother used for making lace. That thread fascinated me as a child, but what amazed me more was this. At the end of the street, plunging into depth, in that top corner flat we spent every summer in Vienna. After the war, my father became a painter by profession, and from the 60s on, he painted most of his pictures in Vienna, of Vienna. He always painted from life and out of doors with us, his family, in tow. Looking at this painting in my bedroom in Pittsburgh, I could see my window in Vienna observed through a window of my father's home. So that's our window there. That apartment, this apartment, though, In fact, the whole building is gone. Ruined in the war, it was replaced by a modern apartment block. Chance brought us to our apartment in the Ruppgasse in the Leopoldstadt district, but as I followed my father through Vienna on his restless search for places and people to paint, I felt that what kept him going, the secret that urged our family on, was that lost interior. I'll be guided here then by an intuition. Homemaking in Vienna was our rehearsal for exile. People created their dream interior, haunted by the possibility that they would have to leave. You might object that this is a retrospective projection. The catastrophe in 1938 projected back on the period around 1900. Back then, people were arriving to Vienna in staggering numbers. Immigrants lodged in crowded tenements called rent barracks in districts like Leopoldstadt. And I know these tiny apartments. Ours in Vienna was one of the last, a walk-through kitchen and one all-purpose room with the toilet and running water in the public corridor. Around 1900, such a home was a place of arrival, not of departure. Wasn't it only afterwards, after the ruptures of 1918, 1938, and 1945, that Vienna became unhomely? The city's most famous son helps here. In 1919, in the wake of World War I, Freud published an analysis of the uncanny, in German, das Unheimliche. The word is key, because in German, heimlich means homely and familiar, but it also means secret and strange. Supported by this duality, Freud argued that the uncanny, spooky stories, images, and events, differs from other terrors because what terrifies isn't strange, but familiar. And the familiar terrifies because it had been repressed, but has now come to light as if by chance. The uncanny takes time. It takes time for home to become strange and for the familiar to seem foreign. The uncanny is not, though, a retrospective fantasy. Rather, it is a past whose action has been deferred, like a time bomb. Retrospective accounts of fin de siècle Vienna, like those of Musil, Broch, Friedel, and Stefan Zweig, foresee catastrophe. Uncannily, so did people of those times, like Karl Kraus, looking forward from the past. My method is to travel this labyrinth with home as my guiding thread. This means reversing Freud's emphasis. Instead of penetrating the mysteries of the mind through the paradox of the uncanny or unheimlich, I'll explore das Heim, the home itself, as a place of the mind. The Reformation of the Viennese Interior began with an effort to show art in a new way. In 1897, the year before Loos published The Potemkin City, a group of painters seceded from the city's exhibition society, the Künstlerhaus. Calling itself the Sezession, the group styled itself also as a succession, where the young succeed the old as if in a natural progression. The cult of youth in art came late to Vienna. A quarter century earlier in Paris, painters rejected from the Salon had exhibited in an annex, the Salon of Rejects, only to become the dominant forces in European art. By 1897, rejection and secession were old strategies for emerging talent. Vienna secessionists aimed to free artistic expression and to educate the public taste. They criticized the conservative Künstlerhaus for the crowded warehouse look of its shows. Indeed, they sought to reinvent the meeting place of art and audience. Their first exhibition, mounted in 1898 at the Horticultural Society on the Park Ring, showed artists of a range of styles. The mode of display was more revolutionary than the art. The show's designers, architects Josef Maria Albrich and Josef Hoffmann, constructed a sequence of smaller interiors within the venue's cavernous interior. Like the set designers of Vienna's opera, theater, and balls, they erected ephemeral dividing walls. Shaped in dramatic arches and volutes, these acted as coulisses to frame well-orchestrated views. Paintings were grouped by artist and hung at eye level with room to breathe, making appreciation of individualities more focused and intimate, while also avoiding old disputes over whose painting hangs low and whose gets skied. A consistent decor unites the whole. Textiles with vegetal ornaments upholster the walls. The secessionists also introduced into the ensemble many works of applied art. Kept out of art exhibitions earlier, these allowed visitors to admire Vienna's crafts. More crucially, they integrated painting itself into the semblance of living space. Although they railed against the commercialism of the Künstlerhaus, the secessionists marketed their work. Through the experiential structure of their exhibition, they projected what it would feel like to live with such things in one's own home. The layout, the hang, the decoration, together these constituted what the organizers called the arrangement. Variable and improvisatory, arrangement, they used the French word arrangement, coped with artistic diversity. Secession's decor depended on Art Nouveau, arts and crafts, and Jugendstil, but it also marked a new departure. The poster for the 1898 exhibition advertises this. Nervous tendrils conjure the dark forest or maze where Theseus slew the Minotaur. They are applied as spirals to Athena's grinning Gorgon shield. But these tendrils invoke an origin more primordial than a mere contemporary fashion for curvy lines. This decor frames something surprising, a surface parallel to the picture plane and empty save for the artist's signature, Gustav Klimt. Shouting its presence by being blank, the plaster wall will be the creative medium of the Viennese interior. The secession was less about new art than about a new encounter with art. To show art differently required a new building. This building, likewise called the Secession, rose on the banks of the Vienna River, a short tributary to the Danube. At 1898, during the building's construction, that river, which had caused many disastrous floods, was being canaled and covered by a street and market with a line of Vienna's new municipal railway running by its side. One of the great developments of the city's infrastructure, the regulated Wienfluss and high-speed Stadtbahn, were the work of Otto Wagner. Wagner realized that Vienna's future lay in rapid transit from the outlying districts to the center. People could now shoot to work by train along what was once a dangerous waterway, their movement made natural by the river's course, their nerves soothed by Wagner's watery decor. This old photograph of the Secession under construction shows its original link to Vienna's underground springs. Olbrich, the building's architect and one of Wagner's most trusted collaborators, intended his building to stand in its own park and thus serve as a leafy oasis in the inner city bustle. The park eventually shrunk to a fringe of lawn, but Olbrich referenced the trees in his building's ornament. Foliage rendered in shallow relief sprouts from the plaster walls. It pushes up through the heavy tablature to form the cupola, really a semi-spherical pergola of gilded bronze, which the Viennese call the Krauthappel, or cabbage head. This vegetal motif figures prominently in the published organ of the Secession. Founded in 1898, the magazine Ver Sacrum, in Latin Sacred Spring, featured on its first cover a tree with roots bursting its wooden planter. But Olbrich laid the symbols of organic renewal over a crystalline structure of blank, windowless walls. Detractors took the building to be a nebulous evocation of Egypt or Syria. They ridiculed its foreignness. Here the satirist Edvard Pertzel writes "Meshuggah" in Yiddish, crazy, over here. Entrance to the building through its small setback door becomes a liminal passage like stepping over a threshold to a mystery. The dedication over the portal, written in raised gold lettering over a huge overdoor, announces the mystery to be the enigma of the new. To the era, its art; to art, its freedom. Ludwig Hervesi, one of the Secession's most eloquent champions, coined the motto. It condenses the findings of Viennese art historians. Every epoch creates its own most adequate forms. Classical, Romanesque, and Gothic stand on equal footing. Therefore, the modern age must create its own distinct forms rather than reach back in history to old ones. The Secession vows to give art to the era by giving freedom to art. But what will this art look like? The Secession building is more radical inside than outside. Olbrich created a single open space supported on just 6 points. It's evenly lit above by skylights. It's the white cube of modernist display. Exhibiting art in the Secession involved building an interior of movable walls and then putting in the objects. Temporary halls, doorways, ceilings, even floors could carve out an interior from this vacuum. The creations didn't last. The organizers documented their work with photographs and floor plans and published these in magazines. They also gave to their whole endeavor a name, Raumkunst. In English, space art or spatial art, Raumkunst was not an artistic style like Tonkunst was to music. It was an art of arts that integrated sculpture, painting, and the crafts into a total experience. The thinking was that in the past, the arts had formed a seamless whole, like the cultures that made it. Temples and cathedrals don't display images as museums do. Rather, images belong to the architecture. Gothic statues functioned as columns, and columns were individually carved like statues. Modern artists, they argued, suffered a rift between their products and their culture. Formerly craftsmen, they became exiles with an audience that no longer understands. Raumkunst dreamt of bringing art and artist home. In 1902, in their 14th exhibition, the secessionists tried to realize that dream of Raumkunst. Quote, "From the yearning for a great task," explains the catalogue, "a task that would transcend the usual painting of pictures, there sprang the thought of daring to do something in our own house, which in our times is withheld from the creative urges of artists, the purposeful furnishing of an interior." End quote. In the beginning was a yearning, in German Sehnsucht. Sehnsucht isn't simply a wish. Infused since the Romantics with the pathos of the unattainable, it simultaneously remembers loss and foreshadows future failure. It is yearning turned into an addiction, a Sucht. The secessionists yearned for a big task that would lead art out of the humdrum business of just painting pictures. From this yearning came a daring thought to decorate an interior. The dream sounds strange to our ears. When, except as postmodern irony, has an ambitious artist yearned to do interiors? How did it happen, then, that in Vienna at 1900, this became the great artistic purpose? The 1902 exhibition focused its task on an occasion, the inaugural display of Max Klinger's sculpture of Beethoven. Created in Paris and costing a fortune, this mixed-media colossus would honor Klinger, whom the secessionists admired, while also celebrating Beethoven and Vienna. It's difficult to appreciate just how deeply the Viennese venerated music. Cultivated persons were possessed by their musical passions, which in the era before recorded sound, they expressed it, if possible, by playing music. Hausmusik was the hallowed ritual of the Viennese interior. Ludwig Wittgenstein recalls how at 3 a.m. in the morning, in his music-obsessed childhood home, he awoke to thunderous piano. It was his brother, Hans, a musical protege, maniacally performing his own composition, oblivious to his family gathering to listen to genius incarnate. In Vienna, if one couldn't play masterfully an instrument, one is expected passionately to love music. For the secession, celebrating Beethoven raised the game. Though it lagged behind Paris in painting and behind London in empire, Vienna was the undisputed capital of music. It was the home of Gluck, Haydn, and Mozart, of Schubert, the Strausses, and Brahms, of Bruckner, Hugo Wolf, and Gustav Mahler. Soon Vienna would see the birth of modern music through Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. But Vienna was most of all the holy city of Beethoven, descended of the gods. Klinger's Beethoven didn't motivate the exhibition. As the catalogue explained, it only gave a guiding idea. Now kept in Leipzig, this oversized marble effigy sits on a throne of marble, bronze, onyx, ivory, mother of pearl, and opal, and that throne and an eagle rests on a huge, roughly worked marble slab. To modern observers, the work might seem a kitschy mix of styles and materials, but to the Viennese audience, the work achieved a fabulous synthesis. It drew 58,000 visitors, the most in the secession's history. Klinger compared his creation to Wagner's operas, which aimed at total art. Color, banished from modern sculpture, here returns, not according to Klinger for realistic effects, but to conjure the mysterious aura of materials itself. The effigy does have a waxworks look. Its face derives from a life mask taken in plaster from the composer in 1812. Such realism, though, is willfully disrupted, as befits the creator of the etched series A Glove, so admired by surrealists. Color makes a specific historical claim as well. Gottfried Zemper, designer of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, argued that the ancients painted their buildings and that classical purity, embodied by the white marble statue, was a modern anachronistic invention. Klinger's sculpture referenced one of the 7 wonders of the world, the statue of Zeus at Olympus. Made of gold and ivory, this colossus stood 40 feet high. Klinger's is smaller. It turns Zeus into Beethoven, though, complete with the eagle, the thunder god's animal companion. The eagle is also the attribute of John the Baptist, and this gets a little complicated, who appears on the rear of Beethoven's throne between Christ's death on the cross and the birth of the Virgin. Portrayed with Beethoven's features, or so people think, the evangelist seems to command, indeed to musically conduct, a symphony of sacrifice and beauty, the Christian and the pagan. The secessionists read closely popular accounts of Darwin. These held that humans not only descended from the apes, endowed with unique capacity to create new worlds, humans could evolve beyond their own old religions and ascend to the status of gods. Klinger's Beethoven leans forward over balled-up hands as if straining to hear inwardly a new musical synthesis. But what kind of interior did Klinger's Beethoven motivate? Firstly, the outsized statue encouraged minimalism in the surrounding architecture. It couldn't compete with that. Joseph Hoffmann, the exhibition's designer, left vast areas of plaster blank. Decoration retracted into the very substance of the wall. Secondly, Klinger's statue determined architectural type. An idol for the cult of art, it needed a temple setting. Hoffmann placed the statue on an octagonal pedestal along the central axis of a great hall. He flanked the statue with 2 narrow side rooms. There they are, and you see you go through here, down some steps into this big room. There's the statue, and this is the room we'll mainly focus on with the Klimt frieze. He flanked the statue with 2 narrow side rooms, raised up a bit so that visitors had to descend to enter the Sanctum Sanctorum by a narrow staircase. This plan enabled Hoffmann to turn a visitor's path into a rite of passage, with the initiation ritual occurring in the left side room through the exhibition's most famous feature, a frieze painted directly on the plaster by Gustav Klimt. Many descriptions of the show have come down to us, but none gives us a first impression. On entrance, sheer empty space must have been the initial experience. Hoffmann built a white room with almost nothing in it, no framed canvases, no decorated upholstery, just plaster walls, which were themselves austere, square forms instead of curved coulisses. The wall's unornamented material pushed visibly into space from a dark recessed kickboard. The mixed media reliefs, all square in format, were pressed deeply into this thickness, like jewels in a brooch. Klimt set his frieze 2 inches back as well, allowing its matte surface to withdraw into the periphery. First emptiness, then views of Klinger's Beethoven through those windows, through the openings, and Klimt's frieze, a distant third. That, I think, would have been the natural sequence of impressions. Klimt programmed the process and movement into his work. Running around the building, a frieze sends their viewers around with them. Klimt circles his frieze with a band of sleeping women. Glimpsed already from the entrance corridor, this band, like our experience of the band, begins in the midst of things, with one sleeper already vanished and another now emerging. One prone on her side. These paired sleepers are repeated with tiny differences. They divide up the frieze organically like heartbeats. Even before we know who they are, these women evoke an unconscious realm of life. A watery realm, a kindred realm also comes to mind. The rhythmic, immaterial art of music, perhaps even of Beethoven's music, perhaps even the interposed A major and G major chords that, like an orchestra tuning, opens the Ninth Symphony. And as in that first movement, so too in the frieze, this eerie calm is suddenly broken. The secession equipped visitors with program notes. At some point while beholding the frieze, perhaps when arriving at Klimt's Knight in Armor, visitors would have reached for their catalog and opened to a page headed Left Side, Wall Painting. They could read, first long wall, opposite the entrance, yearning for happiness. Sufferings of weak humanity, pleas of these to well-armed strong man, as his external driving force, with compassion and ambition as internal driving forces. These move to take him up. These move him to take up struggle for happiness. Short wall, enemy forces. Giant Typhon, against whom even gods fight in vain. His daughters, the Gorgons. Sickness, madness, death. Lust and unchastity. Excess, gnawing care. Yearnings and wishes of people fly above and beyond. Short, second long wall. Yearning for happiness finds rest in poesy. Arts lead us over into ideal realm where alone we can find true joy, true happiness, true love. Choir of paradise angels, joy to all the world immortal. This kisses for all the world. This raft of information is not enough to explain the whole. To Klimt's admirers, this abundance signaled his greatness. To his legion of detractors, it just smokescreened the painting's obscene core. But actually, Klimt tells a familiar tale. It's a stock romance with a knight-errant setting forth on a quest to slay monsters and get the damsel in the end. Friezes lend themselves to storytelling. They show things sequentially as if unfolding in time, but friezes also turn stories into festive processions. Klimt's frieze gets you from the primordial buzz of yearning all the way to modern music, but it also stages a tribute to Beethoven with soldiers, suppliants, and musicians marching in the victory parade. In ancient friezes like this one on the Parthenon, myth merges with ritual performance. Klimt's frieze belongs to a pseudo-temple architecture. It styles viewers as initiates to the mystery where they are headed. As initiation, it tells the story of the knight-errant's own difficult trial. The myth, though, is secular, like Mozart's in The Magic Flute, where an exotic machinery gently tests Tamino's love. But there's one aspect of Klimt's frieze that stands apart. It may seem that Klimt's subject is the knight-errant or Beethoven, but they are latecomers, for prior to their arrival, there comes yearning. Sehnsucht, romantic longing for the unattainable, returns as an ethical quest for happiness. However, Klimt pushes yearning back to a time prior to the advent of the ethical self, prior even to the human. This Sehnsucht is biological in nature. It is the energy of life itself, and that's why the knight contends with death and with sex, the one ending life, the other perpetuating it. The findings of modern biology gripped turn of the century Vienna. The life sciences flourished at the university. Vienna's School of Medicine pioneered the field of pathological anatomy. Pathology taught that biological understanding should precede treatment. This applies to afflictions of the mind as well. People now understood them as having chemical and anatomical causes. Human thought itself was no longer an immaterial activity. Neurons could be isolated, stained, and observed. Research showed that the body affects the mind in pathologies like epilepsy and in neurotic formations like anxiety. People began to think of the mind as a complex electric circuit with perception as input, action as output, and memory and consciousness somewhere complicated in between. They also pondered the effects of modern city life on this circuitry. This allegory of electricity appeared in an album also containing emblems by Klimt. It shows an electrical nude genie racing through the overhead cables of Vienna's new trams while the Viennese trudge wearily through the snow. With speed came nervousness, the urban malady. The sinuous lines of Art Nouveau were intended to catch, channel, and soothe the nervous energies of the mind. Darwin's discovery of the ascent of man derived from a more revolutionary insight. Humans have no special place in nature. Their thought and dreams, even their highest ideals, derive from their biology. Freud started off as a neurologist. He made important discoveries in the anatomy of neurons at a time when these cells were still a hypothesis. Here his rendering of nerve cells of a crayfish. To picture thought as an electrical impulse coursing through matter is to found a biology of the mind on a more fundamental physics. The scientist who most captured the Viennese imagination preached precisely this turn. The German-speaking world's most prominent Darwinian, Ernst Haeckel, was also an accomplished painter. He created fabulous engravings of nature's artistry, here microscopic radiolarians, underwater protozoa with intricate silicate skeletons. These prints directly influenced secessionist ornament. Haeckel sought to fold organic life back into the processes of inorganic matter. From his monist perspective, mind was matter, and matter lived, most uncannily, in the adaptive propagation of crystals. Freud wrote famously that humans suffered three great humiliations during the modern era. First was Copernicus, who showed that the Earth rotated around the sun. This meant that our home was no longer the center of the world. After this cosmological blow came a biological one. Darwin ended our supremacy over animals. Psychoanalysis delivered the third most wounding blow. People had fancied themselves supreme, at least inside their own minds. Like a potentate, the ego gave orders and the person fell in line. However, nervous disorders of the kind treated by psychoanalysis taught otherwise. There the ego, quote, came up against the limit of its power in its own house, end quote. There sexual instincts remained untamed and unconscious mental processes thwarted the ego's self-control. Psychoanalysis further showed this to be the case in normal mental functioning. In Freud's words, quote, the ego is not master in his own house. The statement captures the unhomeliness of psychoanalysis. People are bound to resist what psychoanalysis shows. The ego is bound to defend itself against the knowledge that it's a late arrival and that it stands in the unconscious control of the body. Klimt Fries tells a similar story. The I is not master in this unhomely house. It arrives belatedly as an episode in the primordial unfolding of Sehnsucht, or desire. Klimt dresses his knight in armor made for Maximilian, which Klimt scrutinized and sketched in the imperial treasury. Klimt thus associates sovereignty with ancient Habsburg rule, although the knight's facial features are those of Gustav Mahler, Vienna's new champion, of Beethoven. This knight then confronts the enemy Typhon in the Darwinian form of a great ape. Of Typhon's offspring, lust dominates, for lust is what the tableau most decisively arouses and mortifies. Klimt transports Viennese prostitutes from the street to this temple of art, and along with them comes the terror of syphilis. It's as if Klimt had taken a page from the works of Arthur Schnitzler. Although projected onto women, the enemy for Klimt lies inside. Desire is in our own biology, animals that we are. Freud studied the vicissitudes of the instincts, the circuitous paths that instinct takes in human beings. In Klimt, the sleeper's Sehnsucht is not an ethical yearning yet, but there's an ethics built into Klimt's plot. As with Freud, the stranger or foreigner, the other of an ethical encounter, turns out to be ourselves. Unhomeliness lies inside us. We are not masters in our own house. Freud never gave an adequate account of the one positive vicissitude or destiny of instincts, what he called sublimation. Although motivated by the sexual drive, sublimation was thought to divert sexual drives to new non-sexual aims. Objects of sublimated instincts are ones of the highest value, most obviously art. Klimt Fries follows the trajectory from vital instincts through perverse vicissitudes to the sublime art of music. Poesy, poiesis, is the innate power humans have to create new things. Poesy can remake humanity itself. Beethoven personifies the poetical power, and his music brings it home as, listening, the responsive soul feels a higher love. The kiss of Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy is an ethical utopia. It is an anthem of cosmopolitanism. Humanity's millions, all brothers, joined in a single peaceful embrace. In the case of genius, then, the ego can become master in his own home, because genius creates a new house of being. And that is why the secessionists built their model home, their Raumkunst, around Beethoven. Although styled as a temple, the exhibition was more practically, I'll argue, a home. Its arrangement, its arrangement, pertained little to sacred architecture and still less to museum display. Tellingly, it did inspire the architecture of mental asylums. Wagner's church at Steinhof and Hoffmann's own sanatorium design at Purkersdorf evoked the exhibition's purest ambience. But, mostly, Hoffmann's arrangement proposed a new kind of interior for private homes. Contemporary observers recognized Hoffmann's debt to villa architecture. The glimpses of nature in the friezes and reliefs invoked a landscape observed through the open plan of a Mediterranean villa. Villa design, in turn, took inspiration from the exhibition, most spectacularly in the house Hoffmann built for Adolf and Suzanne Soclet. After visiting the Beethoven show, the Soclets commissioned a house like it in Vienna. Transferred to Brussels, they fulfilled this dream there, commissioning Klimt to do a frieze with a kiss as its climax. The framed canvas of, and there you see the study for that kiss. The framed canvas of this motif, painted in 1908, similarly transposes the essence of the Beethoven frieze into a work for a private setting. As the catalog makes perfectly clear, all the objects on display could be purchased, with the exception of Klinger's Beethoven. Karl Wittgenstein, Ludwig's father, who had bankrolled the Secession building, ordered a marble copy from Klinger. Installed in the music room of his fabulous home in Vienna, it provided over Hausmusik by the city's leading musicians and composers. But the Beethoven exhibition didn't merely display art for the home, it showed how to be at home with art. You entered the Secession in a state of nebulous yearning. Confronting through Klimt's fresco the unhomeliness in you, you arrive by way of the magic of art to domestic bliss. The frieze's finale is only partly Schiller's brotherly kiss. It is also the conjugal bed, holy sanctuary of domestic space, where husband and wife unite to create a family. The 1908 kiss makes this biology more clear. It contrasts the egg-shaped flowers on the woman's garb to the erect rectangles on the man's. Walter Benjamin argued that Jugendstil, Art Nouveau, shattered the 19th century interior by turning it into a place of the body, not of the mind. The secessionists went further. They publicized as a public exhibition the corporeal basis of domicile. But this home has more rooms than one. Klimt's frieze gives way via a narrow passage to Beethoven. He is the home's exemplary denizen, the Hausvater, set apart from the pleasures of conjugal bed, having great thoughts in a room of his own. Deaf while composing his final symphony, and shown by Klinger also to look without seeing, the composer, perhaps just now, hears inwardly a new music. In Vienna at 1900, inwardness was synonymous with music. Immaterial as a medium and affecting the soul directly, music brought the self in touch with its good interior. In his Beethoven essay, Richard Wagner argued that the Ninth Symphony was the epiphany of inwardness, because in its final chorus, it transcended orchestration, drawing on the immediacy of the human voice. Gustav Mahler made an arrangement of Beethoven's choral finale to perform at the exhibition's opening. The musicians and singer of the Philharmonic refused. So Mahler reworked the piece for 6 trombones played by retired performers and performed it privately in the gallery. He also reduced it to one section where the voices accusingly asked, "Do you fall down, you millions? Do you sense the creator world?" Perhaps Mahler, Klimt's knight in arms, wanted to admonish a city unwilling to bow down to the modern god of inwardness. But all this, I have to say, has little to do with architecture. Klimt's frieze glosses Klinger's Beethoven, but more importantly, I think, it illuminates the built interior to which it belongs, and that interior consists chiefly of plaster. As the exhibition catalog explained, to be frugally monumental and remain truthful to materials used, Joseph Hoffmann employed the medium most ready to hand, rough cast plaster. Plaster enlivened the walls. Alternating with smooth plaster, it revealed architectonic structure. Of the decorative squares set into this plaster, more than half of them are made of plaster themselves. Here a drawing in stucco relief. Klimt's dry fresco frieze, too, pays homage to its support by leaving great tracts of plaster empty. The critic Joseph August Lux saved his highest praise for those bare plaster walls. Such truth to materials was a, quote, self-confession in which art and ethics find their common roots, end quote. Lux also cautioned against puzzling too deeply over the show's historical allusions. He says, "We aren't Assyrians or Egyptians, not Greeks and Romans, not Arabs or Japanese. We're Europeans of the 20th century, people who, wearing dark suits, combine a heightened inner life with an intense sensibility," end quote. In this epically simplified design, the modern soul finds its, quote, unquote, crystallization point. Ludwig Herwese likewise applauded this raw plaster temple where walls are wall-like. And he zeroes in on certain passages where the interior's geometry seems, quote, to crystallize itself as if of its own volition. Above the doors leading to the Klinger's Beethoven in the central room, Herwese observes plaster shaped like, quote, some unimagined calcite spar. Such capricious shapes, he notes, seem generated not by an artist, but by the materials themselves. Herwese reports that Hoffmann, their maker, called these overdoor reliefs jokingly crystallized plaster, kristallisierte Putz. These objects haven't survived. In the 1960s, art historians glimpsed them in old photographs and hailed them as the origin of modern art. Here a reconstruction made in 1985. Today, these overdoors divide the literature over whether the Beethoven exhibition looks forward to abstraction or backward to the decorated room. To me, these look like a cutaway of the interior of the wall. Now, overdoors are everywhere in Vienna. On old buildings, they feature devices, symbols, allegories, coats of arms that identify the house because before house numbers, houses were named. Overdoors belong to the realm of superfluous ornament that Loos attacked. Klimt himself made two famous overdoors for the music room of the Ring Street Palace. One showed Schubert playing Hausmusik. Hoffmann's overdoors have a less overt message, but they do stand apart from the room's decor, cutting through the subtle frieze of squares. You see, they cut through here, so they're not quite part of just decor. There's something else. Perhaps they allude to music, but abstractly, and with the idea that architecture is a silent music. Abstraction also suited the exhibition's bourgeois public, who, untitled, had no family arms, no coats of arms to place above their doors. The only statement, though, that Hoffmann made about these artifacts was his joke. But why crystallized Putz? What's the joke? In the German of Hoffmann's time, Putz had two meanings. It meant wall plaster, but originally and primarily, Putz meant ornament, and it gathered over time distinct connotations of showiness and superfluous flippery. In 1906, the Viennese public amused themselves reading purloined letters Richard Wagner wrote to his seamstress, the Putzmacherin Bertha Goldwag, ordering for himself obscene quantities of lavish theatrical putz. Such putz was what Loos repudiated and what Hoffmann's new raw plaster rendering replaced. Crystallized putz would be more than plaster, but it should be, as well, ornament returned to its true elemental state. Some plasters actually contain crystal. For example, plaster of Paris, used for Beethoven's life mask. It consists of gypsum and water. Hoffmann probably used a mix of lime, sand, and water, but he shaped it into a form resembling a fabulous mineral deposit hidden within the thickness of the wall. Putz as plaster becomes putz as ornament, yet both remain just putz, hence the joke. Hoffmann centered most of the rectangles symmetrically around a small square at the median. For Hoffmann, the square was both a motif and a tool. Using graph paper, he designed objects that looked like graph paper. There's an object in design, and there's an object finished. Uniquely among the art objects in the Beethoven show, the reliefs were unsigned. But because they displayed Hoffmann's signature squares, the overdoors served to sign the entire exhibition as being by his design. But they do more than that. They do more than point to his person. Klimt embedded a story about instinctual drives into the very walls of the modern home. At 1900, crystals symbolized how organic life adapted and propagated organically. Hoffmann's overdoors thus identify the interior as itself potentially a living thing. Inwardness has been made into architecture. In 1898, the critic Hermann Broch left the Secession's first exhibition in ecstasy. The Viennese Interior, he wrote, had never been as beautiful as this. Entranced by the display of applied arts, he made the following conjecture, quote, "I will tell my architecture my own inner beauty." This he would have to transfer to every material, and every material would speak its language. Over the door of my house, I would write a poem, the poem of my being. And what this poem would be in words, all colors, all lines would be. And every chair, every tapestry, every lamp would be always again the same poem. In such a house, I would see my soul everywhere, as if in a mirror. This would be my house. I would live there, looking at my own face and listening to my own music. In 1898, this was the dream. Soon it will seem a nightmare. You can take a break.